This is the story of American freedom. Theodore Roosevelt ranked Robert E. Lee as one of the two greatest Americans in history, putting him right alongside Lee's idol, George Washington. But on many occasions to this duo, Roosevelt would add Abraham Lincoln, the first truly progressive president in our country's history, as Theodore Roosevelt saw him. Abraham Lincoln ranks with Pericles, Winston Churchill, as one of the three greatest democratic statesmen in history. And by a statesman, I mean, and how we distinguish a statesman from a mere politician, a statesman has a bedrock of principles, a moral compass, a vision, and the ability to build a consensus to achieve that vision. A bedrock of principles, what do I mean by that? It is that set of values by which you live your entire life. And for Pericles, for Churchill, and for Lincoln, that bedrock of principles was democratic freedom, government of the people, by the people, and for the people. A moral compass that guides you through the dark forest of night, life, the same way that a compass guides you through a forest. A vision. Churchill's vision was the noblest in the world, of the whole of the human race marching into the bright uplands of freedom. Lincoln's vision was of the United States as the last, best hope for humanity. Lincoln, like Churchill, like Pericles, had as part of their moral compass a belief in absolute right and wrong. For Lincoln, slavery was absolutely evil and freedom absolutely good. It is, in fact, that moral compass that creates the goodness of your bedrock of principles. Look at Hitler. Hitler had a bedrock of principles. They were evil. He had a vision of a Europe enslaved. What separated him from Lincoln was this moral compass. But you can have the best principles, the best moral compass, the best vision, unless you can build a consensus to achieve that vision, you will go nowhere. Pericles, Churchill, and Lincoln all achieved that consensus, not by propaganda, sound bites, but by the written and spoken word, orations to convince their fellow countrymen, free men and women, to follow them. And so, go back with me to November the 19th, 1863. We were in that small town of Gettysburg, where the great battle had been fought. And Abraham Lincoln is there to dedicate a national cemetery to those brave men who struggled there, and to tell his fellow countrymen why they are in this war that will ultimately cost 623,026 American lives. . Now, the idea for this national cemetery had begun some months earlier. Governor Curtin of Pennsylvania rode through the battlefield in September. He was outraged to see there, rotting in the fields, the bodies of brave Union men who had been killed there. For there was no such thing as an official burial corps. There were embalmers, private enterprise. They'd follow you around, and if you gave them $1.25, they were as good as their word. They'd find your body and identify it and see to it that it was properly buried. When you went into battle, they had given you 6 little tags with your name written on it in case you were blown to pieces. But you were too cheap to pay that $1.25. You had drunk your money up, and so you were just lying there rotting. There was also no official notification of the families. All the newspapers carried casualty lists. They were notoriously inaccurate. Many a mother, for years after the war, would set out a dinner plate. The boy down the road, he had come home after 2 years. Maybe somehow her little boy was still alive and would come home. So Curtin was determined to do something about this situation. And he wrote to the governors of the other states that had men engaged there at Gettysburg, telling them of this outrage. And they determined to create a national cemetery. Now, it is most interesting that they did not apply for a government grant. They raised the money on their own, and they were ready to dedicate it on November the 19th, 1863. They were going to do it up in a grand style. They had invited the most famous orator of his day, Edward Everett, Harvard professor, diplomat, distinguished with his long flowing hair, to give the keynote address. But as the date approached, one of them wrote the others and said, "Don't you think we better invite the president?" "What president?" "President Lincoln." "Oh, no. He's too controversial. His own party is probably not going to nominate him. And if he comes, he's going to do nothing but tell jokes and make unsuitable remarks. Well, let's invite him." So they wrote Lincoln a letter saying, "You are invited, but please don't come," essentially. But Lincoln said, "I'm coming." Oh, what are we going to do? And thus he arrived on November the 18th, there in Gettysburg, the day before the ceremony. It had not been an easy journey. The war weighed constantly upon him, sending all of these young, brave men to their deaths. He was not a handsome man. He would never be elected today, not photogenic. And as the procession on the 19th made its way up the hill, he had been put on a horse far too small for him and his 6'4" frame, and his legs almost touched the ground. He seemed more careworn than ever. His wife had begged him not to go. Their little boy was sick. He had the same symptoms, and they had received the same reassurances from the doctors that they had a few months before, when another of their little boys had died. Mrs. Lincoln, who was never very stable, had also just received word that the third of her brothers had been killed. Her beloved brother Ben. Like the other two, Ben had died serving the cause of the Southern Confederacy. But Lincoln had given his word, and he had arrived there at the National Cemetery where the crowds had gathered. What had brought him there? He was born within a few months and within a few hundred miles of his great opponent, Jefferson Davis. But unlike Davis, who had grown up to be a planter, Lincoln came from a very hard-scrabble farm. His father was harsh. His mother died at an early age. They moved from farm to farm until finally they came to Illinois. And Lincoln got away as quickly as he could. In the whole of his life, Lincoln had less than 1 year of formal schooling. Whenever I watch some student's eyes glaze over, I think, what would Abraham Lincoln have given to be able to come to a great university and study? But he taught himself how to survey in the new little village of New Salem, Illinois. That's where he earned his nickname, Honest Abe. It spoke to his bedrock of principles of complete integrity. He was the only honest surveyor you could find in the county. He studied law, and he went on to become a successful railroad lawyer. The railroads, as they pushed westward, found that their Harvard-educated lawyers didn't play well with these country juries. Lincoln knew exactly what to say and won some major cases. And finally, after some time in the state legislature, he was sent up to Washington as a congressman, right at the time of the Mexican War. He believed the war was evil, that it had only one purpose, to spread slavery. His advisors begged him not to oppose the war. He did it. He opposed the war. And he was not reelected. So he went back home and made more money. And he said, by the 1850s, I was happy. Had a lovely family. We had a beautiful home. I had 3 suits of clothes. 2 black, 1 white, that made me look like a riverboat gambler. But I could not leave it alone. I went back into politics for one reason: to abolish slavery. To stop its spread, yes, but he intended to abolish it absolutely. Well, the Republicans, or Free Soil Party as they were called, the abolitionists, lost the 1856 election, their first election. They felt they were too tied to New England, so they looked out to the prairies, began to notice this lawyer, Abraham Lincoln, brought him to New York, had him give a speech in prime time, and he won their nomination. And then, to repeat, you talk about a polarizing president. 7 states seceded before he was even inaugurated. He tried to say in his inaugural address that he would not interfere with slavery anywhere where it existed in the states, but the Southerners didn't believe him. They hated him, and filled with their ideals of honor and glory, they fired upon Fort Sumter. Already Lincoln was starting to show that he was in fact a brilliant politician and manipulator. Jefferson Davis had all the attributes of a great president: West Point education, war hero, Secretary of War, distinguished senator. But as Lincoln said right before Jefferson Davis fired upon Fort Sumter, I have it on good authority that once you get to know Jefferson Davis, he's the biggest damn fool in the world. and that firing upon Fort Sumter, that brought the Union together. But the war was not short. It turned out to be cruel and bloody as the casualties mounted and criticism of Lincoln in the North became ever more savage, particularly his absolute refusal to sit down with the rebels and negotiate. Thus, he came to Gettysburg to tell his fellow countrymen why they were fighting that war. Edward Everett gave the keynote address. He went on for 2 hours. You're worried I'm going to go on for 2 hours, aren't you? But in those days, people wanted a 2-hour speech. Now we, 15 minutes, and then we need a commercial. Our eyes glaze over. But Edward Everett was brilliant. The crowd was thunderous in its applause. Then Lincoln got up. There were photographers there, and photography was in its infancy. And they had all this equipment and chemicals, and you were watching the photographer. And then you said, when is Lincoln going to speak? He's already spoken. What? 2-minute speech. He sat down. The applause was perfunctory. He said to his friend, that speech was a flat failure. The New York papers the next day said, what an embarrassment it is to have to show a distinguished foreign visitor that man and say he is the President of the United States. But as so often, the real intelligence lay in the heartland. And the editor of a Cincinnati newspaper wrote to Lincoln and said, may I print that speech? And Edward Everett wrote to Lincoln and said, Mr. President, I wish I had come as close in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes to the true meaning of that occasion. And the Gettysburg Address would go on to become perhaps the greatest single oration in American history. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Take that over to the English department and they'll start marking it up. 77 never began a speech, particularly a 2-minute speech, with a parenthetical phrase. 77, what does that mean? 87, why not say 87? Don't start off and leave your audience still trying to calculate what you meant in the first sentence. Why 77? Because it strikes the fundamental note of the Bible. Lincoln was not an ostentatiously religious man. He thought people who went to church were hypocrites. Show me a single church that has as its only creed the golden rule and follows it. Then I might join. But he was our most deeply religious president, steeped in the Old as well as the New Testament. And his audience was almost entirely a Christian audience. So 77, the biblical Old Testament tradition of this nation. Our fathers, one generation had seen the United States go from independence to civil war. Jefferson Davis' father had fought in the Revolutionary War. Brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Brought forth. Again, the English department's going to tell you that's a mixed metaphor. Fathers don't bring forth children, mothers do. But childbirth, it is a hard and bloody thing. And Britain, it did not simply say, oh, go away, old chaps, and have a good time. We had to fight a long and bloody war to win that independence. And a new nation. New not in the sense that I got a new baseball cap, but new in the sense of something that had never existed before, because it was conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Thus, as we have done, Lincoln went back to the Declaration of Independence and the moral values upon which America was founded. We are now engaged in the great Civil War, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived can long endure. There, in one sentence, he has told you why your boy has had to die in this war, what the purpose of the war is, whether this nation can long endure. In all of our time in Afghanistan, we were never told in terms we could understand why. But now Lincoln has told you why fellow Americans are killing each other. We are met upon a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of it for those who here gave their lives so that that nation might live. Your son, your brother, your husband died so that this nation might live. If they came back to you today and you asked them what the noblest thing you could do, they would say it was to die for my country. It is altogether fitting and proper that we do so, but in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor powers to add or detract. Consecrate, dedicate, hallow, these are religious terms, and this ground is hallowed, consecrated by the blood of the men who fought there. The world will note no long remember what we say here. It can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to take up the task that those who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. So he shifts now to you and to your duty. That from these honored dead we take an increased measure of devotion to that cause for which they gave their last full measure of devotion. Of course, we will never negotiate with the rebels. That would be to betray those brave men and all that they fought for. It is for us to be dedicated to the great purpose for which they fought. It is for us here highly to resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. That this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom. Now, I told you that God appears 4 times in the Declaration of Independence, conceived in liberty and dedicated to equality. There's not a single mention of God in the Constitution. As much as he admired the Constitution, Lincoln is telling you that that part is wrong. The signers of the Constitution left God out and wrote slavery in. As he had already said in a Thanksgiving proclamation, he believed that God had sent this terrible war upon the United States for this sin of slavery. Government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Throughout the speech, Lincoln has drawn a parallel between the men who fought and died at Gettysburg, gave their lives for freedom and equality, and another, familiar to, deeply believed in by most of his audience, Jesus, who gave his life so that all men might be free from death. Now, this is not some professor conjuring this up. When those boys marched into battle, what song was on their lips? The battle hymn of the Republic. In the beauty of the lilies, Christ was born across the sea. There's a glory in his bosom that transfigures you and me. As he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free. And now, our democracy recalls the verses of John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him shall not perish, but have everlasting life. On earth, our democracy is sacred. It is a gift of God, and these men have died to preserve it. He would be reelected in 1864. He continued to refuse to negotiate with the rebels until finally came that Palm Sunday when General Lee surrendered. Lincoln urged Grant to let him up easy. That Friday, Good Friday, the day on which Jesus was crucified, Lincoln had a cabinet meeting, learned from General Grant that he and Mrs. Grant would not be able to accompany the President and First Lady to the theater. Nonetheless, not wishing to disappoint his wife, he took her out that evening to Ford's Theater to watch one of those comedies he so enjoyed. And as he sat there, holding his wife's hand in his, a darkly handsome man, an actor, John Wilkes Booth, quietly slipped into the unguarded presidential box and put a bullet through Lincoln's head. Leaping from the stage, shouting, "Thus always to tyrants, the South is avenged." So Lincoln, and this was widely noted, was assassinated on the very day that Christ had died. He lingered on for some hours in misery, anguish, and then passed away. Mrs. Lincoln and others, those who knew him well, understood that he had no fear of death. They knew that he might very well be assassinated. He might very well be assassinated, as he sometimes thought, because he knew as a lawyer that the South did have a strong case for secession. But he was determined to fight this long and bloody war to end slavery forever. He sometimes thought that he must die in order to atone for all the suffering that he had caused. That is true leadership. To take the responsibility upon yourself for your principles, for your moral values, for leading your country on a new path of freedom and justice.
The Story of Freedom in America with Dr. J. Rufus Fears is made possible by the generous support of our Freedom and Heritage sponsors. The Story of Freedom in America is a program of the Institute for the American Constitutional Heritage at the University of Oklahoma, in partnership with the Alumni Association of the University of Oklahoma. For more videos and podcasts, visit freedom.ou.edu.